Welcome back to the show. This week, I'm really excited to have a conversation with Jeff Fullington. Jeff supports neurodivergent men. So a lot of the same things that I do at Starfish Social Club, but most of the people that work with Jeff are men who are neurodivergent. And since the majority of the population at Starfish and the majority of people that are identified as autistic or ADHD are male, it's kind of like Jeff is working with the grown-up version of my students. First, Jeff, I want to have you just tell everybody whatever you want to share about you and about what you do.
Okay, well, I'm Jeff, and I tell people that all the time, especially parents. Like, I am the adult version of your kid, and I made it so I can like. There's hope. I'm a peer counselor. I've been working mostly in mental health the last 8 or 9 years, and I kind of gravitated toward the autism ADHD population. And a few months ago, I started my own practice. So I lost my job 3 days before COVID. So during COVID, I learned to transfer all of the work I do online. And I started doing individual work, group work. And so a few months ago, I started my own practice. And I I shifted to men's mental health the last few years because that's really where my strengths are. And so I work with all men, but I focus on neurodivergent men, autism, ADHD, giftedness, the men that kind of have a hard time finding adequate services through normal channels. And that just started. So I've been doing that. I do a lot of community building. I'm involved in groups and group projects, and that's kind of my passion. And I guess that's it. That's for an introduction.
Okay. And Jeff, can I ask you, um, so the reason that I do what I do is because I have ADHD, and so it's very personal to me. And I came from teaching special education,
Mhm.
and so I was able to see just all the kiddos that were really struggling in the world. But most of them don't stand out, right? Most of them, I call them floaters. They're not being aggressive. They're not eloping. Some of them are, but most of the kids that I work with are not. And because of that, they tend to get missed, or they tend to, especially because it's school and school is academic, a lot of times there are not services and resources for them because they might not need academic help.
Mhm.
So that's why I started Starfish. That's why I do what I do, is because of my own experience and also what I saw when I was a teacher. So do you have a similar story about why your path is your path?
Probably so. When I was growing up, they really weren't looking at things like autism or ADHD, but I was diagnosed as gifted in the first grade, and I was put in gifted programs. I went to a residential school for the gifted, so I was really immersed in that was my form of like difference and
Mm-hmm.
neurodivergence growing up. And so everything weird about me, I'm just knew as oh that's the giftedness. Well, as an adult, I was recently able to go back and identify the autism traits that I also have, the ADHD traits that I also have. And I taught special ed for a few years as well. And most of the kids were so bright. Like, and if you know how to teach them, they learn. And so I didn't see them as special needs, or they just needed a different mode of teaching or and learning. But other than that, they were just as bright, if not brighter, than the mainstream kids. So all of that, I think, working with, and then I worked adolescent psych for a year as well. So I have a lot of experience working with youth. But it was really in my mental health work that I started to realize that I just work better with people. I've always been an oddball, a misfit, kind of an outsider, and so I always work better with those types of people. I'm able to relate to them. They can relate to me. We can build that rapport. I know a lot of the struggles they go to, and the mainstream world of mental health and therapy is very difficult for people that are outliers to find a therapist that gets them, or to find the services they need that can address the full range of their mental health needs. So once I started seeing that niche, I kind of moved into it pretty quickly and have never really gotten out of it since.
Yeah, that's amazing. I also worked in mental health for a while, and I worked at a residential treatment center that was for mental health, but every so often a kiddo would come in that I could tell was autistic. And yeah, they really struggled in that type of system. And I think I believe that a lot of mental health challenges that neurodivergent people face are because they are neurodivergent. I think a lot of anxiety comes, especially people with ADHD, because we're so creative and clever, but that also means that we're creating situations to be anxious about, right? So, and I think I'm not autistic, but I think everybody that I've met who identifies as autistic feels different, feels kind of out of place out in the world. And so I think when you, and even people who are gifted, you feel different, you feel out of place out in the world. I think it's very easy to feel misunderstood. And
Yes.
so I think a lot of mental health challenges that come up for people who are neurodivergent are because we are neurodivergent. And I know for women, it's actually really common that women, when we were young, we get diagnosed with depression, anxiety, personality disorders, and then later get diagnosed with ADHD. And that's actually my story as well. I was
Oh,
diagnosed with depression and anxiety and a mood and a personality disorder. And I wasn't diagnosed with ADHD until 2 years ago. But now none of those other diagnoses, I don't have those things. I just have ADHD. And so it's interesting to think if 20, 25 years ago, if that would
mhm.
have been understood instead of, me being treated for depression and anxiety. So yeah, I think I really love that you are working in mental health, but mental health for people who are neurodivergent. Because yeah, I definitely think it's a different population.
That's a common story that I hear, because if you don't have the expertise in neurodivergence to tell what's mental health and what's neurodivergent, it can all look like mental health to an untrained professional. So that's why things like ADHD get diagnosed as personality disorders or anxiety or emotional dysregulation or whatever. And so having someone that can tell what's neurodivergence and what's actual mental health is really important for that population.
Yeah, absolutely.
And we experience trauma different, like with our sensitivities and the way our brain processes, we experience trauma and things in the outside world differently. And so it takes a different way of addressing it sometimes.
Wait, can you elaborate on that, Jeff? Can you speak to
Well,
that more?
a lot of us, we have sensitivities. We things that are not trauma to ordinary people can be trauma to us because they get magnified, or actual trauma we could experience more deeply or more profoundly, or it can affect our processing differently. And another thing that shows up in ADHD a lot is emotional regulation, because of the executive functioning and the ability to recover from trauma and negative emotions more quickly. So the impacts of events can like linger with us more long and more deeply and longer if we don't have that recovery mechanism to start getting out of it.
Oh, that's super interesting. I actually had not heard that before. That's really interesting. I do also know that kids with ADHD, diagnosed or undiagnosed, get significantly more negative feedback throughout their life than kids who are neurotypical. Because it's, especially if you think of a stereotypical boy with ADHD and just all the negative feedback they're getting at home, at school, from other kids. And with girls, I think girls tend to be more internalizing, but the concept of being told that you're lazy, that you're not trying hard enough, that you just don't care. Girls getting feedback for maybe not paying attention. So I think a lot of times we can develop mental health challenges because of all the negativity that comes in from just us existing the way that we exist, especially if we're in a traditional school system, or if our parents are trying to use traditional discipline strategies. And, I think, I've told stories about my childhood before where you definitely get the message that there's something wrong with you.
Oh yeah.
That you as a person are not okay, that there's something wrong.
Yeah. And it's easy to internalize if you don't know how not to. And I call it social trauma because like if you can't integrate socially with your peer, it's going to impact your development and your ability to be resilient and recover from mental health issues.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it definitely has a compounding effect. If you take a neurodiversity and then you take mental health challenges and then you take social challenges, right?
Hmm.
They all just compound each other. Absolutely. If you don't have a support system,
Hmm.
for when you're having mental health challenges, or, I can see how all of that completely compounds on top of each other. Okay, let's turn this around and let's focus on one of the things that we wanted to talk about today was focusing on the strengths of our neurodivergent kids, teens, adults, whatever it may be, which I think goes right into what we've been talking about for the last several minutes. So you and I both have more of a strengths-based approach.
Yeah.
And I think, speaking specifically about social skills, that's one of the things that I know about most social skills interventions is they are more deficit based. What are the things that you're not doing,
Hmm.
that you quote unquote should be doing, right? But even social skills is also typically a pull-out program. So kids are getting pulled out of their classroom for it. They're basically being labeled and identified as needing help in something that most other kids don't need help with. And then you go to social skills and it's all these things that you're not doing correctly. Right. And there's even certain methodologies that are trying to reinforce you into doing things that everybody else is doing, which
Yes.
basically, so the message is that what you're doing is wrong
Yes.
and what everybody else is doing is right. And therefore, I'm going to see how I can incentivize you into doing what's quote unquote right. So definitely want to hear your take on how you support the people in your program from a strengths-based approach.
Well, a lot of what you described is trying to get, let's see, how do I want to say this? It's neurotypical social norms and trying to get people that are not designed that way internally to fit into or accommodate themselves to norms that are not natural to them. So I try to find their natural norms and build around that. And I focus on the strengths. I focus on what they can do and what they're good at that we can build on, more so than what their deficits are in relation to neurotypical social norms. So if a kid's really good at math or art or building or whatever, I'm going to focus more on that than if they're energetic and move around a lot or squirm or talk a lot. That doesn't bother me so much as what they can do. And so I try to normalize behavior that falls outside, because the neurotypical norm is kind of a middle range. It's a very narrow window of what's tolerable, acceptable, and everybody wants well-behaved kids that can fit into that nice window. But there's a lot of behavior that's not pathological. It's not even problematic, like stimming. I rock. Talk. Some people are talkative or being quiet. I like introverts, and I try to normalize all of that and expand that range of what's considered normal so that they don't feel self-conscious or they don't internalize any negative messages because they're energetic or because they're talkative. And I just redirect onto what they can do. And it's different for each person.
Mhm.
Neurodivergence is so individualized. So each kid's going to have a particular set of strengths. And a lot of things that are perceived by as weaknesses by the neurotypical crowd can actually be strengths. Talking a lot can be a strength if you know how to build on it. Having a lot of energy can be a strength if you know how to channel it and direct it. So even things that are perceived as weaknesses, I can usually reframe and build into a strength.
Yeah, I love how you say that, because I I can't think of anything that is considered problematic that I can't reframe, right? Even, some of our kids that maybe could be considered bossy or controlling, they
That's
have
leadership.
amazing, yes, yes, they have amazing leadership skills. It's just a matter of helping them understand how to be an effective leader, right? But yeah, that's great leadership skills. The kids who are they get, a little bit stuck in routines and habits, man, those are the people that are our engineers and our scientists and our mathematicians, right? So I think anything that may be a little bit frustrating, a little bit annoying, there is absolutely a plus side to all of that. It's just helping our kids find that path for themselves, right?
Yes.
Helping them find the path that builds on those strengths, and then helps them turn it into something that could be a career path or a hobby or a lifestyle. Think about, even so, all the people that are in professional sports that talk about how they always had so much energy as a child, right? And now they're Simone Biles, right? I think she's won more gymnast medals than anybody else. She has ADHD. Michael Phelps, the
Oh.
swimmer, has ADHD. So it's, you take these kids that probably when they were little were bouncing off the walls,
Mhm.
and now they have a focus for that, right? They have a path for that, and now they are two of the most decorated athletes in the Olympic world. So yeah, I
Yep.
really
And
love that concept of focusing on what are the things that you're good at, or that you know a lot about, or that you naturally gravitate toward, and where can we go with that?
yeah, and creating environments where that's supportive and that can thrive. And a lot of it is patience and time. I have a very high, like wide tolerance and a lot of patience. So things that bother other people don't necessarily bother me. So when they're around me, they can relax. They don't have to worry about like, am I doing something wrong? Am I not behaving the right way? Am I getting on somebody's nerves? They can let all that go. Just be who they naturally are. I can usually handle it, tolerate it, and then we can get all that out of the way and focus on the good stuff.
Yeah, yeah.
Because when you're
Without
trying to
that
focus
social
on your
anxiety,
strengths, but you
right?
have to worry at the same time, am I doing it right? Am I doing it? Like that's like a double track processing that divides and splits your focus. So if you can get one of those out of the way, then they have their whole bandwidth to just focus on the good things about themselves. And
Yeah, that social anxiety, right? That
Mhm.
worrying about how you're showing up in the world. Yeah, absolutely. Okay, another thing that we wanted to talk about today, which I think really relates a lot to what we have been talking about, but the concept of normalizing things that behaviors, skill sets, coping mechanisms, just normalizing things um that aren't typically quote unquote normal, but just allowing and being okay with, and you've already mentioned rocking, talking, just things like that. So do you want to talk more about that too? You also use the word destigmatizing, right?
Yeah, destigmatizing and normalizing that comes up a lot for it's been coming up a lot lately, even with me as an adult. And I specifically look for environments where I can be. I'm horrible at masking. I don't want to have to mask. I don't notice when I rock. I talk with my hands. That's been a problem for people before. I don't. I need environments where all of that's going to be tolerated and not problematized in any way. So I need people that can where that's normal. It's completely normal for an autistic person to rock. So they need to be in an environment where that's not going to be made an issue. And if I can't find them, I create them. So I kind of niche build, and I'm very alert. I know exactly the type of environments that I need, and I'm very alert to when I have them and when I don't. And when I don't, I can move out of them very quickly and go find the ones that do provide that, or I can create them myself. But I've had to learn that over the years. It's also not internalizing other people's opinions of how you should be and negative messages around that. Um, there are parents that like kids that can sit still in church. There are parents that like kids that can be quiet and let the grown-ups talk and not ask a bunch of questions or interrupt. I don't want a kid to internalize something negative about himself just because those particular adults have those particular preferences. So it's kind of educating people that just because you prefer a kid to be still and not talk a lot doesn't mean there's something inherently wrong with it's not a moral issue. Talking or moving is not a moral issue. And so there's nothing inherently wrong with how the kid himself is showing up. You just need to find an environment where it's not an issue. It's an issue for you. Just go find them a friend group where they can run around the playground and it's not a big deal if they move around, or find some adults that don't mind answering questions or like being interrupted.
Yeah, I noticed that in my program, we have a pretty wide spectrum of kids, ages, abilities, cognitive levels. It's a pretty wide spectrum. And what I really love about that, so many things, but one of the things that I really love about that is that I will sometimes just stand back and pay attention to some of our students who do more autistic stereotypical behaviors, right? Like maybe they're running around the room, maybe they're, vocalizing, making different noises. I really love how the other students at first, when someone's first exposed to something like that, they think it's weird, they think it's awkward, but noticing how nobody else cares. And so what usually happens is when kids are first in my program, they're noticing stuff like that. But then they're also seeing that nobody else cares, and so it usually only takes a few weeks before nobody cares anymore. And I teach all my kids to give each other social feedback. So for example, if we're trying to do like today we were playing a memory game where you have to be able to listen to other people. And so if somebody's running around the room and making a bunch of noise during that, that would be difficult, right? But then we can give that person feedback and say, hey, I can't hear the other kids when you're making that noise. Can you please sit somewhere else or go to a different, whatever the case may be. But I really love how, even for me, there's sometimes where I think about giving somebody feedback about something, and then I realize nobody else cares. Like there's no reason for me to say anything about it because the other kids don't care. And if they do care, they will say something about it, right? They will give this person
Yes.
helpful social feedback. But I've found myself in that situation a lot where I realize, even one time a couple weeks ago, one of the kids, we were asking each other questions about things that we had drawn. And one of the kids asked a student a question, and I interpreted it as almost like a criticism of the student's drawing. And so I said something about it, and the kiddo who said it said, oh, I didn't mean, for it to be that way. And he said, but I understand how it might have sounded that way. And then the kid that he was asking answered his question and took no offense to it at all. And I realized I was wrong, right? I was the one who interpreted it as negative when neither one of them did at all. And so then I had to backtrack and, oh, I need to apologize to you guys for intervening when neither one of you guys interpreted it the way that I did. So I even have to be careful about that sometimes, about noticing that maybe I'm the one misinterpreting something, or I'm the one thinking that, people are going to be bothered by something and nobody else cares.
That happens so much, the misinterpretation. And not reacting is a great way to normalize something.
Hmm.
And I like that your use of I statements. Like if the kid's running around, I find it hard to hear. I need to be able to listen instead of stop running around. You're disrupting the thing, because that puts that starts to introduce that negative message into the behavior. And I'm really big on internal locus of control. And so I statement keeps the locus on the person that needs to listen and to communicate that. And with the two kids you were talking about, having it just work it out among themselves. Like if the kid didn't mean it that way and the kid didn't interpret it that way, then there was no problem. But if there was, either one had the internal locus to address it if it became an issue.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's how I teach the kids to give each other feedback, is to just, point out what's happening and then say, like, I can't hear, or, can you're too, I feel uncomfortable when you're so close to me, whatever the case may be. And also that if you're the only person who's bothered by it, probably should just let it go. Right.
Yeah.
Because sometimes we get kiddos who want to give everybody feedback about everything. Right. And so that's our expectation here, is if you notice that nobody else cares, you should probably just let it go. Right. Or you can move yourself somewhere else if you want to.
Exactly.
Right. You can go find, a different chair, a different table. But that's usually what happens, is maybe one kiddo will be bothered by something and nobody else has even noticed that it's happening.
Yeah,
But
that's how I do it in my groups. Is everyone has the agency if they're bothered by something. We have breakout rooms because I work online. We have breakout rooms. You can leave the Zoom. You can go to another room. But just because you're having a particular reaction doesn't mean that everybody else has to start doing something differently to accommodate that. You can self-accommodate your own reactions.
yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And because I think, a lot of us do have different sensory sensitivities. So there are definitely times where you may be bothered by something that other people aren't. Like, I cannot handle whistling. Oh my gosh.
Oh,
Cannot handle that noise, but nobody else ever seems to care. But yeah, that's a great example. It doesn't mean that what you're thinking or feeling isn't relevant. It just means, just like you said, Jeff, it doesn't mean that everybody else has to change. Right.
it,
So I think that's a great middle ground. It doesn't mean that your feelings don't matter. It
right.
just means that you are probably the person who needs to do something different.
And it's a lot easier. I'd rather manage something myself than depend on other people around me to like do so. If I'm able to like put headphones on or leave the room, that puts me more in control of the situation than having it be at the mercy of other people to figure out what I need and change what they're doing.
Yeah, that's a great point, because that's, how are you going to show up in the world if you're always relying on other people to
Yeah.
change what they're doing to accommodate you? Right. And so that's a
It's just
great
more
point.
empowering to
Hmm.
like, manage as much of it as you can on your own.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great point. Um, okay. Another thing that we wanted to talk about was just the importance of having like-minded peers that you can engage with, have community with, spend time around, whatever that may look like. And one of the things that I wanted to ask you about that, Jeff, since my primary population is kids and your primary population is adults, I would really like your perspective on the things that you see with the adults that you work with that possibly could have been different if they would have received more support when they were younger.
I think the support would be in the form of having like peer groups of people like them. Like that's it shows up in several areas, and I would say this about any identity group, but particularly the giftedness. Being I was the only gifted person at my school, and until I was in gifted programs with other gifted people, I didn't have we need that access to our peers for our development. We need to be able to mirror and see ourselves in each other and learn from each other in a way that we can't from an out group. But I would say that applies to any group. I would say autistic people need to be around other autistic people and learn from them and teach. Like it's a mutual process.
Yeah.
Men need groups where men can reflect and understand each other. Women need women's groups. Different cultures need their groups. So I would say that what I found with the gifted program would apply to any group. So if the younger you can get that, the more it's going to feed into your social development. And a lot of people that come to me, it may be the first time in their life they're meeting other gifted people or other autistic people, or it's the first time in their life that as a man they can come and talk with other men about the things that are important to them. And so it's stuff that could have happened at a younger age had they had those opportunities, but it's happening as an adult. But it's not that different from what a kid would be getting if he's like what your program is doing, which I think is fantastic. That's exactly what I think, not only for neurodivergence, but for every identity out there. The
Mhm.
more they can access the peers specific to that identity, the more that part of them is going to grow and develop than if they
Yeah.
had to do it alone. There's parts of me, I got some of that. So some areas of me got to develop, but parts of me didn't. Like there weren't a lot of autistic people around growing up. There weren't a lot of positive male role models. So part of me as an adult, I'm catching up on that part, but some parts I did get, like the giftedness. And so I think as an adult, you're just kind of filling in what you missed from growing up. And the earlier you can have that growing up, the more your development's going to benefit from it.
Yeah, I
But
think
it doesn't take long. Like if you've gone your whole life without access to autistic peers and you spend a week or two around autistic people, that development's going to catch up so rapidly just from that little bit of immersion.
I think it goes back to the concept of normalizing, right? It normalizes who you are and how you show up in the world when you see
Yeah.
other people in a similar light. I One of the things that I find is when kids are in elementary school, they very often do not see other kids who are like them, because
Yes.
elementary school, they're small, right? By default, elementary schools are small. And you're with the same 20, 24 kids all day long. You're in this
Mhm.
pod. And so just based on numbers, there's most likely not someone else like you in this pod that you are in if you're in
Yeah.
mainstream education, right? And so I find that there's probably several other kids in your school, but they're probably in a different grade or a different class. And so I find that a lot, especially with kids in elementary, that they don't have kids that they relate to in school. And then when we get to secondary, and you're not with the same kids every hour because the schedules are different, and middle school, junior schools are bigger. I think every time you make a transition, your world opens more and more. And by the time you get to, high school and for sure college, you have a lot more control over the people that you can spend your time around, and you can join clubs and groups and extracurricular activities where there's more likely to be people that have similar interests to you and possibly similar personalities to you. But
Mhm.
I think especially when kids are young, just because of the way that elementary school is structured, they very often, it's very common for my elementary students to not have friends at school, right? That
Oh,
my program is where their friends are, just because there are not other kids like them in school.
like, I think facilitating those connections as early as possible, like get the 4 or 5 kids from different pods together on the playground or get them together in a classroom
Yeah.
once a week so they can. And everybody needs environments where they can show up and be themselves and have that reflected in a positive way so they can learn and grow from that instead of having it not reflected at all or reflected negatively.
Yeah.
And it with the technology now in this day and age, you have virtual options. If you're the only kid in elementary school like yourself and there are no kids in other pods, maybe there's an online group you can join, or maybe there's a local group like your program. So I think the options or the ability to create those options are increasing in like
Yes.
now than they were maybe when I was growing up.
Yeah, and my program is actually now on Zoom.
Oh,
So yeah,
perfect.
and that's really why I get emails. I've gotten emails from parents in other countries, that have heard about my program or have seen it's come up through Google or whatever. And I interestingly, I have heard from a couple people in the UK who say that the services there's really long waiting lists to even get
Oh,
diagnosed, and then there's just not services there. So it's just interesting how there's just so many barriers to kids being able to be around other kids like them. I know because my in-person program is in a large city, we get kids from all over. So from elementary, we typically don't have kids who are from the same school just because we have such a large population. But sometimes we do get kids from the same school. And I know we had two kids that after they started coming to my program, they noticed each other in their school. They're like,
oh,
oh, like you go to the same school as me. And then they became really good friends because they're not in the same grade. They're a year apart, but they met here. And then they became friends in school because now they know they have that connection, right? We've got kids in my program that I think are going to get married someday,
oh,
but they wouldn't have met each other out in the world. It's because they have a place like this where they belong and they can connect with each other. And you're right. I feel the same way that everything about you that you feel like might be different, you need a community for that. Just like it
yes,
could be your culture, it could be your religion, it could be where you grew up.
yes,
And yeah, your hobby, right? Like
yes.
anything about you that you feel is a little bit different, you need to be in a community for that. Even us, right? As entrepreneurs, as business owners, we need to be around other people that understand that. It's a very different lifestyle.
Yes. And if someone asks me what's the one key to like making it into adulthood and being successful, I would say it's the support system I had from very early. Without that, I can't guarantee that I would even be here or even be in the condition that I am if I was. So facilitating that support system at early in age and having it be stable and continuous throughout life. Maybe not with the same people all the time, but having a consistent. I tell people, add as many people to your support network as want to be a part of it. You can never have one that's too big. So you're constantly building and growing your support network, and the earlier that starts. Are your Zooms, are they national or international, or are they open to?
So they're really open to anybody, but they're in the US time zones.
Oh,
So
okay.
for people who are outside of the US, but if you're homeschooling, right. So there are kids outside of the US who could still attend, but right now they're based on US time zones. So
I
that would
think
be
that is
yeah,
excellent. That what you're doing right now is that is so important. That is one of those key pieces that are needed. So thank you for that.
yeah. Thank you. And my kids can stay in my program for as long as they want to. So in the in-person program, we've got kids who've been in it for 5 and 6 years. And
Oh,
so but the cool thing is that kids come and go, right? And so even if you've been here for 5 years, it's different kids. Some of them are still the same. There's a core group of kids, but then there's new kids coming in all the time. And so yeah, it's really awesome how some of the kids have developed relationships that they've held on to for 4 or 5 years here, but then
yeah.
they also develop relationships. We register several times a year. And so several times a year, there's new kids coming in. But yeah, just that concept that they can stay in the program for as long as they choose to. And some of them, I think, um, don't really feel like they benefit from the instruction anymore, but they definitely benefit because this is where their friends are. And
It's
so they,
community.
yeah, yeah. And some of my older kids, I've actually had several of them that I've paid as teaching assistants because once
Oh,
you've been here for a few years, you know how things work here and you can support newer kids or younger kids because you know how things work, right? And you so it's really cool because it shows me the power of my language because they mimic me, right? They say the things that they hear me say. And so it's a really great reminder to me of the power of my language, because that's what my teaching assistants do. Is they'll say, I've literally heard one of them say exactly a phrase that I say often. And I was so like, he used it beautifully, right? With a kiddo that was having a hard time. So it definitely shows the power of our words. But yeah, to be able to have some of the older students support some of the younger and newer students,
They
that's been really amazing.
That's the other thing, is that mentoring. Like, in addition to peers, having older mentors and adult mentors is the other key piece. So I'm so excited about what you're doing. Does it go all the way through high school?
For students to enroll, it goes through age 21. And
Oh,
then once they're in, they can stay for as long as they want to. So currently I have some students that are 24-ish, because they've been here for several years. And in my opinion, what I teach is the same regardless of how old somebody is. I
mhm.
think I was telling you before we started recording, I have a student who his grandfather was also going through the content with him because his grandfather was diagnosed with autism. And
Oh,
so, but it's the same information, regardless of how old you are, as long as you're, I would say at least 7, right? At least at a cognitive level. I just haven't, I've done adult programs in the past, but I'm not able to have consistent enrollment and attendance. So that's the only reason that my program is not targeted towards adults, is because I've never really had the momentum to be able to maintain adult programs. I was actually talking to somebody the other day who she's now licensed to teach my curriculum, and she just started her own program, and she has 4 neurodivergent kids. And she was saying to me, I think 2 or 3 of them are adults now. And she was saying that her struggle with getting them into a program is that they're adults and they don't want to go. And so I think, when you're kids, your parents sign you up for things. And I will say, I've had my program for 7 years, and there's only been one time that a student has come on the first day and decided not to come back. One time in 7 years.
oh wow.
But their parent has to bring them, right? And so if you're an adult and you just kind of have it that that's not something I want to try, then you never try. And so her talking about her kids helped me realize that that's part of the disconnect when we're adults and we get to make our own choices and do or not do whatever we choose, is that I think often we talk ourselves out of things that would actually be really amazing.
Yeah, the motivation would have to be more intrinsic, I think, as an adult. But I think it's still beneficial. They just might need a slightly different type of program. But maybe some of your kids will be inspired once they transition to adulthood to start something of their own. Now that
Yeah.
they have all that good grounding from you.
Yeah, that would be amazing. That would be so cool. Jeff, is there anything else that you would like to talk about or share before we wrap up our episode today?
Not that I mean, I have my website. I have a weekly men's group on Monday that's open to all men. I like combinations of neurodivergent and neurotypical men because I think we have a lot to teach and learn from each other. And so I do that on Mondays. I have my practice. I'm really just once I get the practice going and I have enough clients, I'm going to be able to do more groups and offer more group options. But I'm trying to build the community around the practice as well. So in addition to individual one-on-one work, they have a larger support community to become a part of as well. So that's where most of my present efforts are going.
Okay, that's amazing. Thank you. Thank you for doing what you do. I really
Cool.
appreciate that.
Thank you.
Okay, so what is your website? You want to, we'll put it in the show notes as well, but if you just want to say it on here.
Okay, it's satyrsgrove.com, satyrsgrove.com.
Okay. And so that's where people can find you online.
Yeah.
Okay. And like I said, we'll put that in the show notes as well. Jeff, thank you so much for spending this time with me today. And for sharing your personal experience, for sharing experience with the people that you work with. I really enjoyed this conversation. So thank you.
Well, thank you too. I'm just so impressed by what you do, and I think you're
Back
doing
at
a
you.
very valuable thing.
Thank you. All right. We'll see you guys again next week.